So, a little while back, I made a video poking fun at the statement that Wings of Fire is just a silly series meant for kids, highlighting some of the crazy deaths and very adult topics that the series likes to dive into. And that video received so many comments about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, and whether it was right or wrong. Some people implied it was downright silly to suggest that adult themes could not be for kids, while others strongly asserted that it is not, in fact, a series at all appropriate for children, and that whoever was in charge of marketing should probably rethink their life decisions. Given the strong opinions in the community, I wanted to make a more serious video on the topic and explain my thoughts on two things. First, that these books are, in fact, made for kids, and second, that this is a good thing. Alright, let's get into it with point number 1. These books are written for kids. Though it's hard to say definitively, we can use clues to get a pretty good idea. There are the main characters who are themselves all around their dragon equivalent of mid to late teens. This is pretty typical of YA fiction. There is the writing style, which, while sometimes using complicated words, tends to keep itself relatively straightforward and simple. In addition, there's the occasional outburst written in all caps, which you don't generally see in fiction for old people. The word count of each book stays in the 70,000 range, again, very standard for children's series. There are a lot of themes of coming of age and of finding oneself, and just as telling, the books avoid swearing and sexual topics almost entirely. Though none of these things on their own are enough to claim it is for sure a kids series, I think the combination of all of them paint a pretty good picture. Perhaps most importantly though, we can look at who the books are marketed towards, and the answer there is definitively kids. They are published by Scholastic, a children's publishing company, placed in kids sections in stores, labeled as for children, and are explicitly tagged as being best for 3rd through 8th graders, ages 8 to 13. So I think it's safe to say that this is, in fact, a series written for kids. But here's the thing that makes this all so much more complicated. This quote-unquote kids series also often deals with some very adult topics, and I'm not talking about the blood and guts and gore. Children handle that just fine. I'm talking about the ideas that the books deal with. They cover very real things like racism, genocide, the ethics of killing, abuse, and trauma, and, well, take your pick of any generally adult topic, and there's a good chance the Wings of Fire books touch on it at some point. So, what are we to think now? I mean, the series is obviously aimed at children, but it really doesn't pull any of the punches you might expect a kid series would. Well, what I would like to argue, and what I made this video to say, is that I think it's actually a really good thing the book series includes these serious topics, and that it is because of them, not in spite of them, that the Wings of Fire series is so good for both children and adults to read. Okay, that might take some explaining. Why do I think we should be encouraging 3rd graders to read about death and violence and patricide? Yes. Patricide. Like, seriously, if I had a nickel for every time one of the main characters kills their father, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is that these sorts of ideas are important for children to explore and grapple with because they are real. Reality is hard and scary, and a lot of terrible things happen in it, but perhaps before I deal with that, I should first cover a concept I learned about in a book on evolutionary psychology. It is the concept of antifragility. Humans are anti-fragile. It's not just that we are tough, it's that when something hurts us, we heal back stronger than we were before, so that it will be harder to hurt us again. This applies at an anatomical level. Play guitar until your fingers bleed and your fingers start to callous. Break a bone and it reforms tougher than it was to start with. And also, generally, at a psychological level. When we encounter stressful things or adverse situations, we become more resistant to them and more able to deal with them in the future. Now, especially with children, we have to be careful not to take this too far. There are some things that, when pushed too hard, transform from learning experiences to traumatizing experiences. If you throw someone in right at the deep end, they might not learn to swim, they might just drown. So we have to make it manageable. If we want children to grow into people who are capable of dealing with the world in all of its awesome and dangerous ways, we have to build up to that. We have to challenge them in ways that encourage them to grow without pushing them farther than they're able to handle. And in the realm of morality and mental resilience, I would argue that book series are the perfect place to do that, and I think anthropological and psychological evidence supports this idea. Interestingly enough, not a single documented culture in the history of ever has existed that did not use storytelling in some form or another. Let that sink in for a moment. Not a single documented culture ever has existed that did not have stories. Societies across the planet and throughout history each independently developed their own stories to tell. That suggests there is something fundamental about the human experience that involves storytelling. We cannot, or perhaps simply do not, as groups of people, exist without stories. One of the current leading theories on why they are so important is that stories allow us to encounter and prepare for situations without having to actually take any of the risks involved in experiencing them. Take, for example, a young caveman growing up in a hunter-gatherer society tens of thousands of years ago. They are not yet allowed to go on hunts because hunts are dangerous. There are spears and wild animals and all sorts of things that might go wrong and kill you, and in order to learn how to avoid those things, you kind of have to experience them. But that raises a problem, because in order to experience them, you have to expose yourself to the very risks that you are trying to avoid. Here is where stories come in. The older hunters, who are themselves experienced enough to know how to hunt safely and successfully, tell stories about their hunts. They describe how they tracked the woolly mammoth, surrounded it, and threw spears while being sure to stay away from the dangerous tusks and flailing trunk. The young caveman learns, even though they weren't there for the hunt itself, how to effectively take down a woolly mammoth. In other words, they have gained experience without actually having the experience. Over time, stories grew more complex. They started to cover things beyond practical skills, and they started to communicate things that nobody had actually experienced. We developed mythologies and religions around those mythologies. These stories usually didn't teach any useful skills directly, but they did teach people how to behave in society, and just as importantly, why to behave as a society. In the modern day, stories, including fictional books, do these same things. Now, that might at first seem weird. Why would I, as a human existing in reality, ever need to learn about how to be a dragon in a world where there's magic and prophecies and all that? Well, on the surface it does seem irrelevant, but a closer look at what actually happens shows us that it is anything but. In the book series, the main characters have to confront challenges. They have to learn new skills, they have to work together, they have to make hard decisions or deal with the consequences of their own actions and the actions of others. They have to confront things that are difficult to confront. Underlying the dragons and the prophecies and the magic are very real struggles that we as people have to face and overcome every single day. When we read series like these, it's fun, and it's also educational even if we don't realize it. We are learning, implicitly, how to exist in a world where we have to deal with things going wrong. And the entire time we're learning, we're relatively sheltered from these challenges. We can start to learn how to address a life or death situation without having to actually experience one. We can begin to understand things like racism, why it's bad, and how to fight against it before we ever encounter it in the real world. We can face things like anger, sadness, hardship, and loss alongside characters who show us how to deal with it, and in doing so, come to be more prepared ourselves in case we ever have to handle it in our own lives. And that is why the fact that this is a kids series is a good thing. It presents difficult and very adult ideas alongside characters who younger audiences can relate to, and deals with them in ways that they can understand, be challenged by, but not be overwhelmed with. As Fritzafella in the comments of the original video so eloquently put it, the world has unavoidable dark elements to it. Sheltering kids sets them up to not know how to deal with hardships as adults, which is just as problematic. The argument I think they are putting forward is the one I am trying to make with this video. It's much better for kids to encounter and grapple with these ideas in safe environments than it is for them to have to do so for the first time as adults when there are real-world consequences attached. So, yes, Wings of Fire is a series written for kids, and it is my sincere opinion that that is a very good thing.